A moment of truth, how justice prevails. It was late evening, and Gerald Whitman, a distinguished African-American judge, was driving home through the serene streets of Riverside Grove, his brand-new silver Lexus, a reward to himself after years of dedication to his career. Purred smoothly along the road, Gerald cherished these solitary moments. After hours in court deliberating cases, this drive allowed him a brief respite to reflect on his day and prepare for tomorrow. The soft hum of jazz played through the car speakers, soothing his mind as the gentle glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet neighborhood. But this evening, the tranquility of Riverside Grove was about to be shattered. As Gerald approached the final turn toward his home, the sudden flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A police cruiser pulled up behind him, and the piercing wail of a siren broke the stillness. Gerald frowned, perplexed. He knew he wasn't speeding, and his vehicle was brand new, with all paperwork in order. Yet, here he was, being pulled over in the very neighborhood he had lived in for over a decade. He eased the car to a stop at the side of the road, switched off the ignition, and rested his hands visibly on the steering wheel, reflex born of caution rather than trust. The cruiser's door opened, and Officer Ashley Connolly, a tall, stern-faced woman, stepped out. Her uniform was impeccably crisp, and her expression conveyed an air of authority. As she approached Gerald's vehicle, the tapping of her boots on the asphalt seemed to echo the tension in the air. "License and registration," she demanded curtly, her tone devoid of warmth or courtesy. Gerald's brow furrowed slightly, but he complied, reaching carefully into the glove compartment to retrieve his documents. "Good evening, officer," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Judge Gerald Whitman. I live just a few blocks away. May I ask what this is about?" Ashley glanced at his documents briefly before her eyes darted back to Gerald. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Whitman," she ordered. For a moment, Gerald sat frozen, the officer's brusque tone catching him off guard. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate," he replied, maintaining his composure. "But can you please explain the reason for this stop?" "Step out of the vehicle, now," Ashley repeated, her hand hovering near her holstered firearm. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Gerald slowly opened the car door and stepped out. The flashing lights of the police cruiser reflected off his car and cast eerie shadows on the quiet street. Gerald kept his posture calm and unthreatening, but inside, a familiar frustration was brewing. He had spent years fighting systemic bias from behind the bench, yet here he was, subjected to the very prejudice he worked tirelessly to dismantle. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. Ashley's eyes flicked to his car and back to him. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen Lexus reported last week. We're conducting an investigation," she stated flatly. Gerald's jaw tightened. "This is my car," he said firmly. "The registration you just inspected confirms it. Perhaps a quick check of your database will clear this up." Ashley ignored his suggestion and motioned toward her radio. Moments later, another cruiser arrived, and Officer Eric Monroe, a burly man with a stern expression, stepped out. Ashley briefed him quickly, gesturing toward Gerald and the car. Eric's eyes narrowed as they assessed Gerald, but he said nothing. "Search the vehicle," Ashley ordered. Gerald's composure faltered for a moment. "I must object," he said, his tone resolute. "You have no probable cause to search my car. This is harassment." Ashley's lips curled into a smirk. "Probable cause isn't your concern. Mr. Whitman, step back." Eric opened the trunk and began rifling through its contents. Gerald watched, his fists clenched at his sides. He had nothing to hide, but the indignity of the situation stung deeply. Then Eric pulled out a black duffel bag Gerald didn't recognize. "What's this?" Eric asked, his tone accusatory. Gerald's heart sank as he stared at the bag. "That's not mine," he said firmly. "I've never seen it before." Ashley crossed her arms, her smirk widening. "Not yours? Convenient." Eric unzipped the bag, revealing several small plastic packets filled with white powder. "Looks like we've got something," he said, holding up one of the packets. Gerald's eyes widened. "This is a setup," he said, his voice rising. "I demand that you call your superior officer immediately." Ashley's handcuffs gleamed in the flashing lights. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," she said, stepping forward. The humiliation of the moment hit Gerald like a blow, as the cold metal of the cuffs tightened around his wrists. He felt the weight of every injustice he had ever witnessed in his courtroom bearing down on him. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar indignities without the means to fight back. A small crowd began to gather, neighbors drawn by the commotion. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing every moment. Among them was Patricia, Gerald's longtime neighbor, her expression a mix of disbelief and outrage. "What are you doing?" she demanded, stepping forward. "This man is Judge Whitman. He's a respected member of our community. Let him go." Ashley turned toward Patricia, her face hardening. "Ma'am, step back. This is a police matter. It's a matter of prejudice." Patricia shot back. "And we're not going to stand by and let you treat him like this." The murmurs of agreement from the growing crowd grew louder. More phones were raised, their cameras trained on Ashley and Eric. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on them, and Ashley's confidence began to falter. "Call your superior," Gerald said again, his voice steady despite the fire in his eyes. "Do it now." Reluctantly, Ashley reached for her radio. Minutes later, Captain Thomas Hughes arrived, his presence commanding as he stepped out of his cruiser. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, taking in the handcuffed judge, the suspicious bag, and the agitated crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Ashley launched into an explanation, but Thomas held up a hand to silence her. He turned to Gerald, his expression softening. "Judge Whitman, I apologize for this. Let's get this sorted out immediately." He gestured for Eric to remove the cuffs. As Gerald's wrists were freed, he rubbed the red marks, his gaze never leaving Thomas. "Captain Hughes," Gerald said, his tone measured but firm, "this is more than a misunderstanding. This is an abuse of power, driven by bias, and it won't end here." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Understood. There will be a full investigation, and those responsible will be held accountable." As the crowd began to disperse, Gerald stood tall, his dignity bruised but intact. He knew this incident was far from over. It was a battle he had to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that too often failed to deliver true justice. Over the following weeks, the story of Judge Gerald Whitman's wrongful detainment spread far and wide. Footage from that night went viral, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Gerald used the platform to push for systemic change, organizing community forums and meeting with police leadership to address the biases that had led to the incident. Officer Connolly was suspended pending an investigation, and Gerald's perseverance inspired countless others to speak out against injustice. His ordeal became a catalyst for change, proving that even in the face of prejudice, dignity and determination could prevail. And through it all, Gerald remained resolute, a beacon of hope in the fight for equality and justice.